Okay, good afternoon. So we're ready to begin. Could I remind everyone, please, if you can, to turn off your wireless so we have enough connectivity in the room. And so today I'm really pleased to Professor Alissa, and I'm going to mess up your last name. You want me to?
Kleinnijenhuis.
Kleinnijenhuis is here. And she's a visiting assistant professor at the Cornell SC Johnson School of Business and affiliated with Imperial College Business School. She graduated from Utrecht in economics and mathematics, Masters of Science in Mathematics and Finances in Imperial College, PhD in Mathematical and Computational Finance in University of Oxford, and then a postdoc at MIT, and I believe the Sloan School, right?
Yes.
The Sloan School. And so involved in many, many activities, and probably too numerous to mention here, but I'll say she actively collaborates with advises governments, central banks, and think tanks and international institutions. And amongst other things, her research examines how finance can advance the public good and leverage the private sector for climate change solutions. So welcome.
So hi everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here today and deliver this lecture that I will talk about climate finance to decarbonize the global power sector. So I'm going to talk about basically a finance solution to climate change. I don't know how much you've already learned about that in your studies here at Cornell, focused on sustainability. But I hope you will learn something new. And if you have any questions at any point of the lecture, please feel free to raise your hand. I'm also going to leave at least 15 minutes at the end for sort of full-on questions. But if you have any earlier urgent question, don't hesitate to reach out. So let me see. Doesn't seem that it's working. Let's see. Yes, it works. So I'm going to start off with an introduction that might have some things that are already extremely obvious to you, but I still want to say it just to make sure we're all on the same page. And that matters in the context of what I will talk about. So I guess the first thing that I would just want to reiterate, that probably all of you know, is, what is the climate crisis? And I would argue that the answer is fairly simple, which is that the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. Out of the 42 gigatons of annual CO2 emissions, almost 37 gigatons stem from fossil fuels. So if we think about what the role of finance could be in resolving this climate crisis, the natural thing is to focus on how finance can help with phasing out fossil fuels early and phasing in replacement renewables to ensure that we do not have an energy shortfall. Now, this is maybe super obvious to you, but if you have listened into a recent convention of party meetings like COP29 in Baku in November 2024, you will have realized that the discussion that took place there revolving on how to update the goal of climate finance that developed countries should offer to developing countries, which used to be 100 billion a year, and that was agreed at COP 2009 in Copenhagen. That's COP15, and that was later affirmed with the Paris Agreement at COP21 in 2015. And so this last COP at COP29 was meant to update this $100 billion goal that was pledged from developed to developing countries. But actually during that meeting and also in the final agreement, which was called the new quantified goal of climate finance, which I will talk about more, but they only talked about climate action. And actually in the final agreement of climate finance, they did not mention fossil fuels once. And that was, of course, in part because the Arab negotiating group said that they would not undersign any deal focused on fossil fuels. And so instead, they kept talking about climate action as if all actions of finance and otherwise are equal. And that's not the case. To resolve the climate crisis, we should focus on fossil fuels. Now, you might ask yourself, why do we even think about finance? Like, are there not other ways to decarbonize the global economy? And here I might again say something obvious to you, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, which is that a lot of the environmental economics literature has focused on carbon taxation as a sort of first best tool to decarbonize the global economy. But the reality is that after at least 30 years of trying, we have only got 24% of global, 24% of global greenhouse gases are actually priced. And even those that are priced way below what most environmental economists and climate scientists would deem to be a reasonable social cost of carbon. So if you look at the carbon barometer created by Kipos Capital, they estimate that the average carbon price globally is around $4 per ton of CO2. And I don't know how much you know, but the social cost of carbon is essentially an estimate of the marginal damage that results from putting 1 extra ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. And then the present value of that, of all the future damages. So the reality is that we live today in a world of incomplete carbon taxation, where only part of the global greenhouse gases are priced, 24%. And even those that are priced are typically priced way below reasonable estimates of the social cost of carbon. And also not all greenhouse gases are priced. So the question is essentially, in this world of incomplete carbon taxation, which many deem to be a first best tool to decarbonize, is there a role for finance to plug the gap to still try to attain a social optimum? And so there are recent papers within the academic field of climate finance that have sought to study whether climate finance indeed can plug this gap. And one of the papers is by Lasse Petersen. He's a professor of finance at the Copenhagen Business School, a very renowned scholar with over, I don't know how many citations. And he just put out a paper in 2023, which not even yet published, called Carbon Pricing versus Green Finance. And it's a bit of a technical paper, but essentially some of the key results are, if you have complete carbon taxation, then there is no additional role for finance, because you've already perfectly well internalized the carbon externality through carbon taxation. But if there is no complete carbon taxation, then finance can try to plug the gap. Now, in his paper, he uses a fairly restrictive definition of climate finance. And by the way, I also do a podcast, which you can find on my website, on climate finance. So I've interviewed him about this paper for my podcast. I think it's quite an interesting conversation. In any case, so he narrowly defines climate finance as the cost of capital differential between brown and green firms. So basically, if you are a corporation and you try to borrow money, then it is typically the case nowadays that you pay slightly more to borrow in terms of your interest rates and so on, if you're a brown firm, and that higher charge reflects the carbon risk of the transition risk, essentially, of being a brown firm. And so what he shows in his paper is that in order for the cost of capital differential, for green finance, which he defines as the cost of capital differential, to replicate a carbon tax, that cost of capital differential, meaning the difference between the cost of capital of a brown and a green firm, will have to rise to quite a large amount, let's say 18 basis points, he estimates, to replicate a global social cost of carbon, $190 per ton of CO2, to do the same thing as a carbon tax. And if a carbon tax is already covering half of global emissions, you need a smaller amount. But his result is essentially that it's pretty hard under this more restrictive definition of green finance for green finance to sort of plug the gap. And moreover, what he shows is that that the cost of capital differential will make borrowing for brown firms more expensive. But if you need asset stranding because you want to stay within the remaining carbon budget, so you need to close fossil fuels early, then green finance cannot replicate the carbon tax because green finance only makes borrowing more expensive. But if you have, let's say, a coal-fired power plant that does not require new funding, that a higher cost of capital will not induce it to close early. So his result is essentially, yes, green finance can replicate a carbon tax, but only in a world where you don't need asset stranding. And in order to do it, you need to get such a big difference between the cost of capital in brown and green firms that it's not clear that that's still realistic. But what I argue is that his definition of green finance is kind of restrictive. There is a broader set of green finance operations. And this has not been theoretically studied yet, but I would argue that green finance can replicate a carbon tax. But again, the critical result of his paper and some of the other work is that if you have full carbon taxation, there is no need for green finance because then you would just double replicate tools to attain a social optimum. So basically, what I want to focus on in this paper is to try to answer the question: if we're not living in this world of full carbon taxation, can we use climate finance to still decarbonize the world? And since the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis, we should be directing climate finance towards phasing out fossil fuels early and replacing that. And since the climate crisis is a problem that involves, it's a speed and a scale problem, right? It's about gigatons and doing that fast enough to stay within the remaining carbon budget, we need to do it at speed and scale. Now, this seems, of course, probably obvious to you, but if you actually look at how the world currently operates, you will find that most of the renewables, that the growth of renewables, the exponential growth of renewables, has come from renewable addition, not from fossil fuel replacement. And a lot of the literature in climate finance, in the academic field of climate finance, is not actually focusing on the gigatons, on fossil fuels. Maybe one fun fact for those of you who do not know, but the dean of the business school here at Cornell University, Andrew Carioli, he was summoned in 2018 by actually the current King of England, back then Prince of Wales. And he said to Andrew Carioli and to other editors of top finance journals, why are you not publishing on climate? Then Andrew said, well, because we don't get submissions on climate. And then he set up a registered report format at one of the top 3 finance journals, which led to the first special issue on climate finance in a top 3 finance journal in 2020. And since then, the field has really exploded. So what I want to focus on in this paper that I will present today is on the power sector. Why? Because the power sector represents 15 gigatons out of the 37 gigatons of annual emissions. Moreover, the power sector is also a sector where we actually have the scalable technologies available to actually mitigate emissions. So what I'm showing you here is a report from the UN, the United Nations, that they published just before COP29 in 2024, called the UN Emission Gap Report. And what they show here is the mitigation potential of different sectors. And they estimate that for the power sector, out of the 15 gigatons that we emit today, we can likely abate about 12 gigatons by 2030. And by 2035, around 14.7, so nearly all. So, whereas of course there are other sectors that are harder to abate, where we do not yet fully know how to decarbonize it. So, I just want to note some of the earlier work on which the paper that I will present today builds. and as well as some of the articles in the Financial Times in case you want sort of a non-technical version. So I just want to sort of explain, I guess, some of the sort of very high-level results, which I will get back to in this paper. So I wrote a paper called The Great Carbon Arbitrage, where we estimate what the costs and benefits are of phasing out coal. And one of the big things that we showed there, as well as in a follow-up paper called The Economic Case for Climate Finance at Scale, is that the provision of climate finance is not just charity or an act of sort of a moral obligation. Now, this may, again, I don't know, probably doesn't sound logic or how to say, like obvious to you, but let me give the background. So in 1992, we had the first big international climate agreement, the UNFCCC. And as part of that agreement, there was a principle established called common but differentiated responsibilities. The idea that the world as a whole needs to get to net zero in time, and everyone needs to go to net zero, but developed countries should go faster than developing countries, and they should take the lead to help support the decarbonization of developing countries. And then, as I already mentioned, in 2009, at COP15, for the first time, there was an agreement where developed countries pledged to offer 100 billion a year of climate finance to support the decarbonization of developing economies and also to help with their adaptation. Basically to reflect that, you know, the developed countries have historically been most responsible for the cumulative emissions. And they are also the relatively most wealthy. So there was this expectation that developed countries would help developing countries decarbonize. But it was always understood that the $100 billion goal was, or pledge, which was ultimately met late in 2022, was not actually reflecting the needs of developing economies. It was largely a political number. Nevertheless, it sort of codified the idea that developed countries are the ones that are morally obligated to pay. And so then when in 2015 the Paris Agreement was agreed, this $100 billion goal was copied. It is part of the annex of the Paris Agreement. And Article 9 of the Paris Agreement actually focuses specifically on climate finance. And I think it's Article 9.3 that says that developed countries should take the lead in providing climate finance to developing countries. So if you have read the news over the last years, whenever they would talk about climate finance, they would always say that it's, you know, a moral obligation. And still to this day, if you were to ask, I don't know, India or so, they would probably say, you know, we don't want to pay for our own decarbonization. It's the West that caused the climate crisis. You have the moral obligation to pay and to help us adapt to climate change. Now, what we basically showed in this paper, or what we recognized first of all, is that if you ask, you know, what drives action or what drives financial markets, typically and individual people, it's very often incentives. As you know, being an economist, we know that people are driven by incentives, and particularly by financial incentives. So, you know, whilst it is logical to frame climate finance as a moral obligation, ultimately, if you ask developed countries to pay money at the scale of trillions, which is really what these developing countries need to decarbonize, it's not a very strong impetus for action. You know, people are willing to give a bit of money for charity, but not a whole lot. So what we asked in this paper is, you know, is there also an economic case for developed countries to offer climate finance at scale, at the necessary scale, to developing countries? And what we basically found in this first paper is that if, and in the second paper as well, even if developed countries were to pay in its entirety, and these first papers are focused on coal, on the cost to phase out coal early and to replace it with renewables, those costs are smaller than the economic benefits that developed countries would obtain in terms of lower climate damages to them and lower adaptation costs. So basically what we ask in this, what we argue in this paper is that there are essentially two major components of cost of climate finance. The first cost, one is what we call the opportunity cost of coal, and the other is what we call the investment cost in renewables. And I'll get back to that when I present the power sector paper, but basically what we're saying is, if you want to close coal early, there's a cost of closure. And also, more importantly, those that operate these coal mines and coal-fired power plants have revenues that they lose. And those that work in the coal sector might lose their job and may need to be retrained. So that's one part of the cost. The other part of the cost is the cost to build something in its place. It's the investment cost in renewables, but also the investment cost in complementary technologies like energy storage, short and long term, and the grid. And so what we sort of said in this paper is that, you know, especially in developing market economies, you know, if you actually look at the amount of investor inflows into green infrastructure, into renewables, it's very, very low. There's a report on this by the International Energy Agency and the International Finance Corporation called Blended Finance for Emerging and Developing Market Economies. It was published in 2023. And so what they basically document is that the cost of capital of investing in emerging and developing market economies is typically prohibitively expensive, meaning that for investors, the risk of investing is too high compared to the returns that they expect to earn. So as a consequence, and moreover, and this has to do with political risk and with, you know, exchange rate risk, with off-taker risk, all the sort of risks that you might find in these emerging market economies. And so as a consequence, the amount of investor inflows into these markets has been at a trickle. So what we argue in these first two works is that what you really want to do is to use some degree of public funding, which could be offered by developed countries, to try to de-risk the investments into renewables in emerging and developing market economies by means of what we refer to as, and what is referred to as, blended finance. So what blended finance essentially does is it combines public and private funds, where the public funds are used to de-risk the investment, so that the risk-adjusted return, which is the metric that investors use to invest, and that needs to be high enough, so the risk needs to be low enough, the return high enough, that investors can come in to invest in emerging market and developing market economies, not because they are impact investors or because they're ESG investors, but simply because it's good business. And this also matters, especially in the US now and in the last few years, because the Republicans are increasingly trying to argue that any bank or other asset manager that does ESG investing is breaching fiduciary duty, that they're not actually, you know, managing the money well for their investors. So what we basically say is by what we're saying is, by using some degree of public funding, we can make it in the financial incentives of private finance to pay for most of the renewable phase-in. And what we're saying is that if you are able to tie climate finance to emission reductions by making sure that it's tied to phase out and phase in, so that you actually avoid emissions, you can actually estimate what the benefits of avoiding emissions are to the financiers, to developed countries. And so the question is, you know, how can you estimate that? Well, one way to do it is by looking at the size of the avoided emissions times the global social cost of carbon, which gives you then an estimate of the global benefits from avoiding emissions. Of course, the social cost of carbon, you know, now I'm getting nerdy, but is a marginal estimate. So you would ideally look at the average social cost of carbon for a large-scale emission reduction. But to get an estimate of how a particular group of countries, let's say developed countries, benefit from avoiding emissions in another set of countries, developing countries. What you can do is looking at how does the climate finance that developed countries provide to developing countries result in emission reductions in these developing countries. And if we multiply the emission reductions with the share of the global social cost of carbon that belongs to developed countries, you can actually get an estimate of how their provision of climate finance helps reduce climate damage and adaptation costs in their own jurisdiction. And so what we say is that you can basically, that it's also in the economic interest of developed countries to pay that public part of the investment cost in renewables, because the cost of doing that is smaller than, even under a conservative estimate, than their avoided climate damage and adaptation costs. And then finally, what we say in these papers is that, oftentimes we think of, any compensation to polluters, to fossil fuel owners, as morally reprehensible, because you don't want to pay your enemy. But what we are arguing is that if you do not, make it a just transition where you somehow compensate those that are left behind, it's very unlikely that the transition in a country will take place in the first place. So, for example, if you have Indonesia, but there's a very big fossil fuel sector, and the Indonesian government says, okay, we're going to switch to renewables, but 1/3 or a large fraction of their population is invested in the fossil fuel industry, it's very unlikely that that government will win the next election if they don't, make sure that the fossil fuel industry is somehow not left worse off. So what we are arguing is that, one way to decarbonize the global economy is by means of carbon taxation. That's, you're trying to internalize the negative externality by means of taxation. That's the Pigovian approach by Arthur Pigou. But then there's also another approach, which is the Coasian approach by Ronald Coase. Ronald Coase won the Nobel Prize for his work on environmental and other economics. And basically, one of the critical insights of Ronald Coase is the insight that paying the polluter to stop polluting is sound economic logic when it makes you economically better off. And so what we argue is that even though it sounds counterintuitive, paying the polluter, meaning in these cases, these papers, the fossil fuel owners, the coal owners, to stop polluting is sound economic logic, because it makes the world a lot better off. And so I'm not going to show you the result of these papers, but what we find is that if you look at the total climate finance cost for these economies, the lion's share of the cost is actually investment cost in renewables. That's the big, the upfront cost. But actually paying for global coal closure, like buying out the coal industry, is actually extremely cheap. Whereas the economic return on doing that is really big, because coal is an extremely polluting, large cause of global, big cause of global warming, but also a big cause of air pollution. And then the final thing, and I'll continue with presenting the paper, is the work which I published during COP29 called COP29, the economic case for a new quantified goal of climate finance at scale. And here I did something that many academics would not venture to do, which is to actually try to apply my work to the negotiating context of the COP negotiators. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there was this agreement to provide 100 billion a year from developed to developing countries to help developing countries decarbonize. But it was always understood that 100 billion a year was a political number, not actually reflecting the needs of developing countries to decarbonize. And so my work, but also some work by other economists, estimated that these developing countries needed at least 2 trillion a year or so to help them decarbonize. So that's a lot more than 100 billion. And so during in the run-up to COP29, and so importantly, already during the Paris Agreement, or at the time of the Paris Agreement, they agreed that a new goal would be agreed before 2025, so at COP29. And so in the run-up to COP29, the different countries met in working groups to formulate a draft agreement. And that was the basis on which the COP29 negotiations of the top delegates took place. And so basically the elements under discussion were, what should be the new quantity of climate finance provided, how, both in terms of total amount of public and private, what should be the public amount that the public sector, specifically developed countries, pay. That was one of the, so they refer to that as the total quantum and the inner quantum, so the amount. The other part of the negotiation was, when should that be provided, starting in 2025 or starting in 2035? What actually should count as climate finance? So one of the things that was not agreed in the earlier climate finance negotiations was, what do you actually count? So, if you look at the 100 billion goal that was in place and that had been met in 2022 for the first time, there were some cases where developed countries simply provided a loan to developing countries at market rates. And obviously, most people would agree that that is not actually climate finance because you're just lending at normal rates. Now, another thing that happened is that developed countries would provide concessional loans, which means that it's still a loan, but the interest rate on that loan is lower than what you would pay on the market. But what we argue is that even that is not really fair. What really should count as climate finance is only the provision of finance that is offered in grant form or in grant equivalent form. Because otherwise you're saying, let's say to India, I'm going to give you climate finance, but actually I'm giving you a loan, so you need to pay it back, right? And frankly, I agree with India that they say that's not really fair, is it? So grant equivalent climate finance basically means that it's either a grant, literally free money provision, or it is the grant element of any loan. So for example, if you have a loan at market interest rates and a loan at concessional interest rates, then the grant equivalent climate finance is basically the difference between those interest rate payments and that discounted back today. So it's sort of the present value of the grant element, if you like. So anyway, and then the final thing that was under negotiation was, who contributes. So if you look at the Paris Agreement, there is a very clear definition of what a developed and a developed country is, developing and developed country is. And that definition was the classification of who is developing and developed was agreed during the first climate agreement in 1992. So for example, China is up to this day classified as a developing country, meaning that it's in principle entitled to receive climate finance. Whereas most would agree that nowadays China is no longer really a developing country. It doesn't really need climate finance. It can pay for its own decarbonization. So one of the other elements under discussion was, should there be, who should remain recipients of climate finance, and should we expand the contributor base of developed countries or others that can actually help pay for this? So anyway, so what happened during the COP29 meeting is that and it was ultimately not a success. So my paper was got quite a lot of attention at the top of COP. It was read by all the, those that are the top negotiators, like the Wopke Hoekstra from the EU and John Podesta from the US. But ultimately, they did not deliver. So first of all, the negotiating tactic of the EU and the US was that they didn't want to talk about any numbers until some countries that are currently developing would agree to join the contributor base. And China and so on basically said no. So still to this day, based on the COP29 agreement, China is still a developing country and it's entitled to climate finance. So then at the last day of COP, finally, the developed countries put on the table a promise, right? They said, we're going to pay I think it was 250 billion by 2035. And then all the developing countries kind of screamed and said, this is not good enough. And so in the end, they agreed to provide 300 billion by 2035 a year, or at least 350 billion by 2035 a year. This is basically where so to be precise, developed countries promised to take the lead in providing 350 billion a year by 2035. And they put in the agreement that all actors are called upon to try to reach 1.3 trillion in total. Now, me and my co-authors, and we also collaborated with leading climate scientists like Johan Rockström, you might know him. We then wrote a joint statement saying this is completely out of whack with 1.5 degrees. Because if we actually look at the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees, it's currently 180 gigatons or so. And at the current rate of emissions, that is depleted by 2029. And if we were to go linearly to net zero, that's depleted by 2035. So offering 300 billion of climate finance by 2035 is completely out of whack with what is needed, which is to decarbonize in the next 5 to 10 years, not in 2035. The other part is that basically the developed countries only agreed to take the lead in providing 300 billion, but they actually did not agree in the end on what counts as climate finance. So who knows what they're gonna do. So we basically wrote a joint statement, which was then covered by, right after COP by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, saying that the climate finance goal was too little, too late, and by too many sources, whereas you needed to have full-scale climate finance in 2025 of grant equivalent form to help developing countries implement their nationally determined contribution. So let me take one sip of water and I'll explain. So as part of the Paris Agreement, and I'm sure you've learned it in your other classes, countries are expected to submit updated nationally determined contributions every 5 years, and they ratchet that up in ambition. So after the Paris Agreement, the first submission of the updated nationally determined contributions, which are basically the country's climate pledges, was in 2020. And 2025 is the year where countries are meant to submit a new update that is more ambitious. Now, that emission gap report that I referred to earlier estimates that the current nationally determined contributions imply 2.8 degrees of warming. So currently the country's climate pledges are completely out of whack with the Paris Agreement goals. And the climate science points out that every 0.1 degree above 1.5 significantly increases climate extremes and climate tipping point risks. So it's extremely critical that countries revise their climate plans to make it consistent with the Paris Agreement goals, specifically ideally 1.5. And the reality is that most developing countries do not have the financial means to pay for the decarbonization themselves, which is why this new quantified goal of climate finance was deemed so important, because it would have helped pay for the implementation of Paris-aligned nationally determined contributions. And of course, if they only offer this by 2035, that is by no means good enough to support updated NDCs in 2025. Also, because the updates only happen once every 5 years, the next time an update happens is 2030, when we're out of the carbon budget and the current rate of emissions, certainly for 1.5 degrees. So anyway, maybe I'll just really quickly fast forward, and then I'll kind of talk about the results of this paper. So I just published an article or a commentary in Nature. It was published online this Thursday, and it will be published in print again last Thursday. It will be published in print this Thursday, which is a paper that I wrote with Johan Rockström, again a climate scientist, and then the co-director of the PIC Institute with Johan Rakstrom and Patrick Bolton, my colleague at Imperial, and Jeremy Zettemeyer was the director of a think tank, leading EU think tank, Bruegel. And so what we basically ask, and then I'll get to the power sector paper, we sort of say, okay, what was one of the reasons why such a bad climate finance deal was agreed at COP29? And of course, I don't know all the reasons, right? But one of the big things that happened, which I briefly mentioned earlier, is, well, first of all, what is important to realize? The COP process always relies on a global agreement. So in order to get a new quantified goal of climate finance agreed, every single party of the Paris Agreement needs to agree. So what do you always get? You always get every single COP a watered down deal that is never ambitious enough, never commensurate with the depth of the climate crisis, because basically you get a deal that is the lowest common denominator, right? So in that context, William Nordhaus, who I'm sure you've heard of, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on the economics of climate change, he wrote an article called Climate Clubs, which was published in 2015 in the American Economic Review, which is a top economics journal. And he also wrote an article in 2020 in Foreign Affairs, where he basically said, normally when a soccer coach, loses 20 years in a row, you would have long fired this soccer coach. But with the COP process, we keep relying on a global deal, whereas literally for 20 years, it has not delivered any meaningful action on climate change. Of course, it's a useful gathering place for climate enthusiasts. So it has its benefits, right? It gathers attention globally to climate change. But actually, up till today, global emissions are still rising. We're not even on the bend yet towards net zero. And so what he then proposed is this climate club idea, basically saying, we don't need a global deal. I mean, that would be to solve this global externality problem of carbon taxation. Ideally, you want a global deal. But if that's not feasible, if we cannot, agree with all countries on ambitious enough action, we can try to form smaller deals with coalitions of the self-interested willing countries that agree on a common course of policy. So the climate club idea, which I would actually refer to as a climate carbon club idea, is the idea that a smaller group of countries can agree on a homogeneous carbon taxation policy, and that has been to some extent implemented in Europe with the European emission trading system. And they would want to do that if it's in their own economic interest, which you can make it if you put a carbon tax around the border or a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So, and that is exactly what Europe is going to do, right? They're going to implement a carbon border adjustment mechanism to ensure that there's no carbon leakage when they implement the carbon tax, and also to ensure that they don't have a massive competitive disadvantage. So what we argue in our new article is that, like the climate carbon club, we can actually form a climate finance club where we do not need a global agreement on climate finance. We can actually form an agreement with a coalition of the self-interested willing countries that, out of their own economic self-interest, can decide to support decarbonization in developing economies. And just one more thing. So what happened at COP29 is that, and you can literally read it in a newspaper, it was not even a secret. The Arab negotiating group basically said, we're not going to support any deal on climate finance that targets specific sectors, including fossil fuels. So that climate finance agreement is not allowed to mention fossil fuels at all. Whereas the developed countries like the EU, they actually read my paper and they understood that for them to offer climate finance at scale, it was only going to be in their economic interest if they could actually tie that to emission reductions, which primarily comes from phasing out fossil fuels. So my hypothesis is that part of the reason, surely not all, but part, for why they offered a deal that was too little, too late, of not high enough quality climate finance, is that they knew that they were not able to control how that money was going to be spent, and it was not going to be in their economic interest because they could not tie it to emission reductions. So what we argue in this paper is that what we want to sort of encourage is for developing countries to submit credible, conditional, nationally determined contributions. So there are two types of NDCs, climate pledges. One is unconditional, the other is conditional. Unconditional is what a country pledges to do, irrespective of external support like climate finance or other technological support. The conditional NDCs are what developing country or any other country would pledge to do, conditional on getting external support from climate finance. So what we are arguing is that what we encourage developing countries to do is to at least submit conditional NDCs that are aligned with the Paris goals, that are aligned with at least 2 degrees, ideally 1.5. And what we encourage developed countries to do is to, or a coalition of developed countries, is to commit to offering climate finance at the requisite scale to those developing countries that submit credible conditional NDCs. And importantly, I'm not sure if I have this on the slide here, but I guess I have it, well, I will just explain it in words first, I'll get back to it. What we show is, the big thing obviously that happened since last year is that Trump came to power and that the United States has stepped out of the Paris Agreement. So it is very unlikely that the US, in fact, almost 0% likelihood, that they are gonna offer one dime to help pay for decarbonization elsewhere. So what we show in this work is that even if the United States would not pay anything for international climate finance, it is still in the economic interest of a smaller coalition of developed countries, specifically the EU, Canada, Australia, Japan, and so on, to collectively pay for decarbonization in developing market economies. And what we estimate is that if China does not have to be funded, if the petroleum-rich states like Kuwait and Qatar do not need to be funded, who are still currently classified as developing, the annual, if the developed countries were to pay for the power sector decarbonization of all these developing countries, excluding China and the petroleum states, what would be needed is 124 billion of climate finance a year to help decarbonize their power sector at the requisite speed and scale to stay within 1.5 degrees. And what we estimate is that as a percentage of the GDP of this climate finance club, it's actually no more than 0.3%. So, and what we find is that the economic return, meaning the difference, what you get of the benefits to them from avoided climate damage and adaptation costs, and what they would need to pay, that's very significantly positive, but at least a 10% economic return, if not 500, depending on your estimate of the global social cost of carbon and their share of that global social cost of carbon. So just to give you one tangible illustration, I'm saying like, okay, so what are the benefits to these financiers? It's avoided climate damage and adaptation costs. But let me tell you that that's not just a future benefit, that's already happening today. So if you look at just the last half year, the climate damages that the West has suffered have been really big. So in Europe, we have had the Valencia floodings, which were over $100 billion of damages. In the US, we had Hurricane Helene and Milton, which by one science paper was estimated at 300 billion. And we had the wildfires in LA, which are also multiple hundreds of billions of dollars. So the point is that just in the last half year, the climate damages to Western countries have exceeded $500 billion, which is already a lot more than the 100 billion that they are currently offering. And if if the point is that developed countries themselves need to decarbonize fast enough, but the majority of the emissions in the 21st century are gonna come from developing market economies. So if the developed countries cannot get developing countries to decarbonize at the right speed and scale or at all, ultimately it's going to be developed countries themselves that will suffer large climate change and escalating adaptation costs. And we already are seeing that in many countries today, where, for example, in Greece, it's so dry that they have to install all these desalination plants to get enough water to even power all their hotels that rely on large amounts of water and so on. So what we're saying is that the cost to help the world decarbonize is a lot smaller than the costs that we would otherwise suffer to adapt to climate change. And of course, there are also limits to that. So, so that's what we sort of argue in this paper, and there's a lot of variations of this that we show. So anyway, so how much time do I still have?
It's 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, great. Yes. Okay, so I'm gonna skip some of the things here, I guess, but well, maybe I'll talk about it really quickly. So I now want to show you in 10 minutes, and I'm gonna skip a lot of details, but how we, our latest paper on climate finance to decarbonize the global power sector. So as an one more introductory note on this, in some sense, the big question is like, what stage of the world are we in? So my co-author would say stage 1 of the world was to agree on the climate science. Of course, we still have climate deniers, but it's pretty clear, that unequivocal, as the latest IPCC report says, that climate change is caused by, human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Stage 2 of the world was to get countries to agree on net zero goals. And that has, I think about 188 countries or so out of 196 have set net zero goals as part of the Paris Agreement. Not all fast enough and, et cetera, but they have been set. And so what my co-author argues is that we're now in stage 3 of the world, which is actually to get countries to implement their net zero pledges. So this paper on climate finance to decarbonize the power sector is really about, how do we implement a net zero transition that is fast enough to stay within the carbon budget? And how do we actually match financing to support that implementation? Because you can have a beautiful implementation plan, but if you do not have the finance to actually pay for it, that implementation plan is a lame duck. So what we do in this paper is we make use of a data set by Forward Analytics that has information on all the power plants in the world. And their location, but also things like, how much capacity they have, how much emissions they emit. And just as a sort of, a summary, that data set estimates that the total number of operational power plants is around 80,000. And if you look at electricity generation, the biggest source of the largest share of global electricity generation is by coal, that's around 30%, followed by gas around 23%, followed by hydropower, especially in developing countries, there's a lot of hydropower. And then solar and wind wind is around 6% and solar around 3%. And the data set estimates, doesn't capture all the emissions, but that the power sector emissions are around 14 gigatons, which is basically close to 40% of global fossil fuel emissions and about 35% of global emissions. And if you look at the concentration or the distribution of where the power sector emission come from, you see a very sharp concentration. So most of the power sector emissions come from China, that's already 5 gigatons. So, and by the way, in our work, we also show that it's in the economic interest of China to pay for its own decarbonization. So China has thus far pursued a two-pronged policy of more renewables and more coal, right? Whereas what we're saying is it's in their economic interest to actually pay for its replacement of fossil fuels. And it can do so because we have the scalable technologies also for batteries and so on. So there's really no reason to keep fossil fuels on the grid. Anyway, then it's the US, and then it's India, and then a lot of other countries. So it's really critical, especially that these 3 countries decarbonize, but of course the entire world needs to decarbonize. So then what we've done is we've basically created what we call some kind of recipe to think about how to both implement and finance the decarbonization of countries' power sector. And that recipe starts with step number 1, which is to ask, what is the country's current energy mix, right, in terms of the different fossil fuels and the different renewables. And then step number 2 and 3 is basically say, okay, what is the projection of energy demand under current policies, under business as usual? And what would the associated emissions be of that energy mix if it's gonna continue at the current course? That's step number 2. Step number 3 is then to ask, okay, how would emissions need to come down to implement a net zero pathway? Not just one that is net zero, because you can, in principle, continue to emit at full blow until 2049 and then be net zero the year after, and we would far overshoot the carbon budget. So that net zero pathway needs to be consistent with what is still allowed as cumulative emissions given the remaining carbon budget. So then step step 2 is to project emissions under and energy demand under business as usual. And step 3 is to say, how do emissions need to come down to implement a carbon budget consistent net zero pathway? With step 4, you can then say, okay, what are the emissions that we would avoid by choosing to go down a net zero pathway in a country rather than current policies? And so you can look at the annual avoided emissions as a difference between the emissions under current policies and under the net zero pathway, as well as the cumulative avoided emissions, which is the sum of the annual emissions that are avoided. And what my co-authors and I are arguing is that avoided emissions represent a valuable asset to developing countries and to others as well, of course, but we're focusing on those that pay, because it helps, it is worth money in the sense that it avoids climate damages and adaptation costs. Then step number 5 is to say, okay, if we want to implement that net zero pathway, what fossil fuels would need to come offline when to implement this emission reduction pathway? And of course, it's not only a matter of how much capacity of fossil fuels should be phased out, but the question is, that's step number 6, which exact fossil fuel plants would you close down first? So what you really want to do is to specify a phase-out pipeline, which basically says which fossil fuel assets would you close down when to exactly implement that emission reduction pathway. And there are different ways in which you can think about it, but one thing you can do is to say, okay, let's create a ranking that is informed by economics of what fossil fuel plants make sense to close down first. For example, do you close down those first that have the shortest time to maturity, that anyway are close to the end of their lifetime? Or do you close down those first with the highest emission intensity? Or do you close down those first that have the highest benefits to society in terms of lower air pollution and lower climate damages versus the cost of closing it down? So, and then once you have determined what your phase-out pipeline is, you can determine you need to infer how many renewables you would need to build, not only to replace the fossil fuel capacity, but also to keep up with growing energy demand. And how many renewables you end up building depends on things like the capacity factor. So if you're in a country where the sun doesn't shine a lot, you need to build more renewables. So what you want to do is you want to basically specify what we call the phase-in pipeline, which specifies what renewable assets of what type, of what capacity to build when and where as well. And that also, of course, has to take into consideration the existing amount of land that is available for each type. And you can, of course, try to formulate a phase-in mix that minimizes cost and that takes as a constraint the available land, right? So what you've then done is you've specified a phase-out and a phase-in pipeline, and then the next steps are to basically put a price tag on that and ask how much does it actually cost to close fossil fuels early and to replace it with renewable, keeping up with energy demand. And so what we say is the phase-in pipeline cost is essentially equal to the current investment, upfront investment cost, the capex cost of investing in these renewables. We know that we can look up what the prices are today. But if you look at how the investment costs in renewables, but also in batteries and electrolytes have come down over time, we observe that they, for example, for solar, the investment costs in solar have fallen by roughly 20% for each doubling of globally installed capacity. So what we've observed, as documented by Rupert Way and Dawn Farmer, my supervisor at Oxford, are these things called experience curves where the renewables have become cheaper. So what we do in our paper is we basically we take into consideration how the renewable costs might fall further as a function of global cumulative deployment. So you can then put a price tag on this. And then for the phase-out pipeline, we're essentially saying that the cost is the stranded asset value of fossil fuels. So it's the expected discounted missed free cash flows to the fossil fuel plants from closing early, plus any of the costs to retrain workers and offer them temporary wage compensation. And importantly, if you look at the International Energy Agency reports, they often focus only on the cost of the transition. Whereas if you actually want to make a decision on whether it makes sense to transition, you want to also look at the benefits. So what we model in our work is, besides the costs, the benefits, both from avoided air pollution, but also from avoided climate damage and adaptation costs. So once we have specified the phase-out and phase-in pipeline, put a price tag on that, and looked at the benefits as well, the next step is to basically determine a financing strategy. How would you actually pay for this? And here, as I will show you in the later slides, we are essentially saying that, well, there are different ways to finance it, but we are specifically focusing on the economic case for developed countries to help pay for developing country decarbonization. I want to say something else here, which is that thus far, if you look at how finance has been supporting the transition and in general has been financing projects in the world, we have seen a model of what I refer to as project-based finance. For example, the development institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, they always fund, let's say, an individual solar project or an individual, sanitation project, blah, blah, blah. And what we are saying is project-based finance is not good enough to actually implement an at speed and scale transition of the global economy. So for example, if you want to close a fossil fuel power plant early, you cannot do it unless you have a plan in place for how to replace that fossil fuel energy, because otherwise the country gets an energy shortfall and it simply doesn't want to transition. So there are some papers in finance that show that private investors divested in Europe from coal-fired power plants. And in the end, the Polish state ended up buying it because otherwise they would have an energy shortage. So basically you need to tie phase out with phase in, otherwise phase out is not going to happen. Similarly, you cannot just build renewables unless you have a plan for how to connect it to the grid, how to have enough storage capacity of energy so that you don't get intermittency issues. So what we are saying is that in order to implement the transition, you really need to have planned carefully the phase out and phase in pipeline, ensuring that you never have an energy supply shortage relative to demand. And then what we need to do is we need to tie the finance not to a project, an individual phase out or phase in project, but you really want to tie the finance to a country's transition. And I'll go fast forward real quick to the last slide. I'll come back again. So basically, here, wait, yes. So the first cases of countrywide financing packages rather than project-based financing packages are called the Just Energy Transition Partnership deals. These have been agreed in 2020 and with Africa already earlier. where essentially a coalition of developed countries helped pay for the transition away from coal in Indonesia, Vietnam, South Africa, Senegal. They now also have in Brazil an ecology platform. However, the problem, so in principle, so these are the pioneering cases of countrywide transition, countrywide deals to help a country transition. However, the problem with these existing countrywide packages are multiple fold, even though there are many things to like about it. The first thing is that they don't actually offer climate finance at the necessary scale. So for example, with Indonesia, they only pay 20 billion, whereas the Indonesian government estimates that they need at least 100 billion. We estimate it's even more, like 250 billion or 265. Ours is aligned with the Paris Agreement, Indonesia's is not, but anyway. So it's not big enough scale. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that the finance offered was mostly in the form of loans, even though concessional loans. So it was not actually grant equivalent climate finance. And they didn't actually tie the finance to a very specific phase out and phase in schedule. So there's and because they did not offer enough grants, but only loans, countries like Indonesia and South Africa are still struggling to close the first power plants. And they're trying now to raise money to close it by means of carbon credits because they didn't get enough grant money to just pay for that. So I believe I'm out of time, is that correct?
Yeah, we should leave a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I guess I just want to, well, maybe I just want to show you, one last slide and then I'll skip the rest. But I want to show you, the example of Indonesia and India here. So if you actually look at, I'm doing here India first because it's the biggest country. If you actually ask, so how many power plants, would need to close to implement a 1.5 degrees aligned decarbonization schedule, and when? Well, first of all, you find that. So this is a lot of details, I know, but what this is showing is the annual emission reduction that needs to take place. And the first thing you observe is that the bulk of the emission reductions really has to happen prior to 2035. So, in some sense, I'm now trying to persuade my scientific co-authors that net zero 2050 is, at least if you go somehow linearly, by no means good enough to stay within 1.5 degrees. We need to be closer to like net zero by 2035, given how much we've continued to emit. So for the power sector, certainly where we have the at scale and speed technologies, the scalable, economically viable technologies available, we really need to decarbonize the power sector, in the next 10 years. And if you actually look at, okay, what does it imply, right, to stay close to 1.5 degrees? In the case of India, you would need to close like over 100 power plants a year. It's a very large number. Of course, this is the biggest country. And for Indonesia, it's about, 50 or so a year that need to be closed. And that is, of course, not going to happen unless you are having a very tight plan in place for how to ensure that you don't have an energy shortage. And this is exactly what we're showing in the case of, India. You can plan it such that the electricity supply demand under business as usual is exactly met in the same way under net zero, but you need to tie phase out very closely to a phase in so that the overall energy supply is the same. And then the final note I want to make, and then I'll close, is that if you look at, developed and developing countries here at the top, this is the electricity supply under business as usual, net zero, and then the decomposition of business. I need to use this. So this is the electricity supply under business as usual, and this is the current policy electricity supply. The net zero electricity supply is by our model guaranteed to be exactly the same, right? Because you don't want to have an energy shortfall relative to demand. And you need to then do the phase out such that you replace it with renewables so that you get in total the same electricity, right? The big point is that for developed countries, the bulk of the action needs to come from decarbonization because they're very carbonized. For developing countries, decarbonization is also important, but it is also very much a matter of not carbonizing, making sure that they grow in a green way rather than in a brown way. So anyway, there's a lot more details to share, but I will conclude here and thank you so much for your attention.
So I think we have time for one or two questions. So.
Hi, thank you. My question is, because of there's an increase in the energy demanded that we need, and then you want to replace it with renewable technology and remove the non-renewable technology, how do you make sure that you're not increasing the cost for the consumer so that we don't come to a point where a consumer can't afford the electricity?
Okay, shall I first answer it? I wasn't sure whether you were collecting questions. Yeah, so the big thing is that what we are basically arguing is that developed, so for renewables, right, the big cost is the upfront investment cost. That's the really expensive part. But actually, once you've built renewables, to keep running renewables for 30 years, it's extremely cheap. Like the operational costs are really, really low. So what we are saying is that it is fiscally affordable for developed countries to pay for the upfront investment cost in renewables, and then actually running it is super cheap. So it would not actually increase the electricity price, which is indeed a very important concern. And by the way, like one small thing, in reaction to Trump, right, a lot of the developed countries like Europe are very worried about defense, and they're now willing to increase their defense budget as a percentage of GDP. But that also shows that they're perfectly capable of increasing that a little bit for paying for the phase out in other countries. So yeah.
Time for one quick question.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. You mentioned that benefits are significant and at least a 10% economic return to decarbonize the world. So I was wondering what some of the leading factors were considered to make this prediction.
Sorry, can you repeat the last sentence?
I was wondering what some of the leading factors were considered to make a prediction on the economic return of decarbonizing the world.
Can you repeat it?
The factors in making an economic return.
Okay. So basically what we are saying is that what we are basically, I don't know if I'm answering your question the right way, but what we are basically saying is that if the West were to not help pay for decarbonization of the rest of the world, we would, even if, which is already an if, the West would decarbonize in time at speed according to schedule, because most of the emissions are going to come from other countries, developing countries, they will still be headed for climate disaster. So what we are basically saying is that the costs that the West would otherwise suffer in terms of climate damage, like the $500 billion more that I just mentioned, but also adaptation costs, are a lot higher than the cost that they would need to pay for decarbonizing the rest of the world. So the economic return is essentially the difference between the benefits that the West gets from avoided climate damage and adaptation costs minus what they would need to pay for decarbonization in developing countries, which is what we argue 100% of the phase out cost in terms of grants. And we estimate 25% of the total investment cost in renewables to crowd in private capital through blended finance. So the economic return is the benefits minus the cost over the cost. Is that helpful? Okay.
Well, let's thank the speaker.